listening to The Big Album Show with Paul Dillon and Dan O'Neill.
Fitter, happier, more productive.
Hello and welcome to the latest edition of The Big Album Show with me, Paul Dillon.
And me, Dan O'Neill.
Radiohead's three 90s albums, Pablo Honey, The Bends and OK Computer, were among the very best releases of the decade. But of the three, OK Computer was the most defining, managing to say a huge amount about the decade and also about the social, political and technological trends that were blowing in the wind at the time. Now, when OK Computer was unleashed on the world in 1997, it's not an overstatement to say that music would never quite be the same again from that point. You couldn't imagine the music of bands like Travis, Keane, Muse, Coldplay without Radiohead, and you couldn't imagine a musical landscape without OK Computer. The album is a dream and a nightmare from the point of view of two podcasters like myself and Dan, in that there's so much material to draw on. But for me, this album is era defining. The books that Tom York drew on for inspiration were staples on the bookshelves of many of us who were late teenagers in the late 90s. Then there's the politics of the album, the sense of unease and pre-millennial angst. But more than anything else, there's the preoccupation with the technological trends that were forming, the storms that were just about to begin to brew. Now, everyone agreed at the time that the sound was somewhat uncommercial, unconventional, and almost a rebuke of the sound of the Bends, the previous record. But then, my first take, one of many, is that the tracks on the album are extraordinarily tuneful, hummable, and almost without exception, instantly memorable.
Definitely. I agree 100%. I think this is one of the albums that changed musical history. Indeed, friend of the show, Dave Grohl, he said that the release of this album was a pivotal moment in the history of music. This record changed the musical landscape for years to come. And just a fun fact that I heard about when I was doing a bit of research, when sending out the promo of this album across the USA, Capitol, which was the record company that looked after Radiohead in the United States, sent out the album on tapes glued to the inside of tape recorders to all the music journalists and record stores to stop it being bootlegged. Because this album was released very much in the days just before the advent of online music, or at least online music, which came to, take over everything else. By the time Kid A came out, you had the likes of Napster and file sharing, but this came out just in advance of that. And when you think about the content of the album, it's an incredible prescient album. And I think that I agree with you that this is an incredibly hummable, memorable album. And one of the takes I have on Radiohead albums is that Radiohead albums actually become more accessible as time goes on. When you think of the likes of OK Computer, Kid A, In Rainbows, all of these albums, Radiohead are always so far ahead of their time that when you go back to listen to their albums in a few years, they're almost more accessible. But this album was full of very big records, and it came out at a time when MTV used to still play rock music, and a lot of the songs from this album had wonderful videos that went with them that were on repeat on MTV. So it's a brilliant album, and anyone who listens to this album does indeed remember where they first heard it. I remember sitting in primary school, and the lad who shared one of those double desks with me had a tape, a tape, what's it called, a Walkman, a tape Walkman, and he had two tapes that he used to play all the time. One of them was All Eyes on Me by Tupac, and the other one was, or I think it was that one anyway, but the other one was OK Computer by Radiohead, and just a mind-blowing album.
It is, Dan, and I mean, you mentioned there something of the MTV, the MTV generation. Thinking of the MTV Kids. Remember Amy Adams in the film The Fighter? They had her down as an MTV kid. one of the things about this album, and again, there's so much to say, but the videos for the singles are terrific. The first single, of course, was Paranoid Android. The other singles being Karma Police, No Surprises, and Lucky, and all four had tremendous videos accompanying them. Sometimes the videos were quite challenging to watch, and I remember there was an idea that every song on the album would get its own video, but that was ditched. I mean, I think it's worth casting our minds back. I mean, it's very profound that this album predates let's call it the technology revolution or the technological revolution. It predates the displacement really of the traditional model that had really, I mean, the idea, a band, singles, albums, big tours, videos on MTV and so on. That was the model. That model was about to break and everything was about to change. But it's very profound that this album would predate that, and it would be called OK Computer, and it would deal with the technological trends that were developing, and it was angsty about what was to come. Now, one of the interesting things when you cast your mind back to the 90s was that Acting Baby, the next album that we'll be talking about by U2. It sort of was one of the huge early 90s albums, and The Edge said that it was about humans controlling technology, and it was very positive about technology. Tom York took a different view, and this album comes up close to the edge, or close to the end of the 90s, and you have that preoccupation with technology and the angst around it. Of course, somewhat ironic given the fact that this album was made possible by the changing in technology, which allowed the recording process to take place. I think it's right down what you say about remembering the place you were when you first heard these songs. It's a sort of a Princess Di moment, and that we all remember where we were, or many of us do, when Princess Di passed away. We remember, I certainly remember where I was when I heard each of the tracks that led up to, before I got the album. And I think that is an extraordinary thing to say about any record.
Yeah.
But the thing for me, more than anything else, Stan, that what OK Computer represents is an unease about technology and an unease about the technological era. Now, it's sometimes said that Radiohead were the first band to have a website. That's not true at all. That honor often is attributed to Megadeth, who had a site in 1994, very early embracers, if you will, of the internet. The Radiohead site was launched shortly after the release of OK Computer. But if Dan, you remember at the time, Radiohead were very much this idea that they had this big online presence, and then they were the first band to have this a site, a tribute site that was run by fans. So the album benefits hugely from their embrace of technology in the recording process, but lyrically there's the unease about the trends. And there's something of on the one hand, there's the idea of, is the human in command, or is the machine in command of the human? And you can hear lyrically that's coming out. I mean, when I first heard Paranoid Android, that line where he says, "What's this? And the way he sings it, for me, that sounded like it was the end of the world, and some human was looking at this scene that had been completely destroyed and was going, "What's this?" It is an extraordinarily strong album in terms of its lyrics and in terms of what it represents, in terms of the themes it takes up.
Yeah, I mean, there's something very, very Black Mirror about this album in terms of how prescient it is. And when you think of a track, the kind of revolution number 9 of this album, which is Fitter, Happier, it sounds like a kind of a
fantastic track, isn't it, Dan?
It is. It really just it touches a nerve, particularly in the kind of information age we now live in. And it sounds a bit like a Siri conversation with a health conscious millennial who's busy tweeting about the late toy show, buying cheap consumer goods on Amazon, and also having to trying to get someone cancelled at the same time. That's the kind of the paranoia it hints at. And like when you think about the title OK Computer, so it came from the book and the radio show. Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, but the line it comes from is, "Okay, computer, I want full manual control now." And that speaks to the point you made about kind of wanting to take back power from technology and kind of breaking away from the sense of alienation and automation that technology brings with it. And it's also profound thinking about the title of the album, "Okay, Computer," when you come to the realization that right across the world now, families talk into little speakers in their households and say the phrase, "Okay, Google," which isn't too far removed from the phrase, "Okay, computer." So, I mean, these guys were just so forward looking. The album art is timeless, created by Stanley Donwood, who has created, I think, all of the artwork for both Tom York and Radiohead, and it was designed by Tom and Stanley with a tablet and a light pen. And one of the rules that they had when they were designing the album cover was that if they made a mistake or they did something that they didn't intend to do, they had to leave it. And then another weird thing about this album is that it was recorded, believe it or not, in a haunted house. So it was recorded in a place called St. Catherine's Court. It was owned by the actress Jane Seymour, who was, most people will know her as Dr. Quinn, Medicine Woman. And no joke. And Tom said he actually heard voices in the house. He thought they were ghosts, and one of them told him to cut his hair. I think it was Johnny Greenwood had the unfortunate situation where he was given a room to sleep in the house that was full of porcelain dolls. So I can't imagine how creepy that must have been. But I suppose that definitely adds a kind of a strange slant on the album when you realize there's ghosts involved in the making of it.
Yeah, and I mean, it is an album that's haunting at times, Dan. I mean, I would say it's very easy to listen to, but it's not an easy listen. And you mentioned there the OK Computer, the title. I mean, it is a terrific title in that it suggests a number of things. And York said at the time, it refers to embracing the future, but it refers to being terrified of the future, of our future, of everyone else's. It's to do with standing in a room where all these appliances are going off and all these machines and computers and so on, and the sound it makes. I just think that is it sums up the album for me, and it sums up the title. And it's appropriate that we allow Tom himself to sum up the album, because there's so much written about this album. You could easily do a podcast of the reviews of this album, of what people say about this album and what it means to people. But it's an extraordinary, meaningful album. And I can recall very much, it also kind of, for me, going back and listening to it again, Dan, it kind of feeds into a 90s nostalgia buzz, which I think is fairly... let's be honest, it's out there at the moment. I mean, I heard an interview with Damon Albarn a few weeks ago where he was saying, we had so much freedom in the 90s, and that was Damon saying that, who's not normally the sort of person to look back, I think, in a nostalgic way. But I remember when it was released, the fandom, if you will, around it was so intense. The record company, I mean, obviously on the one hand, Radiohead are non-commercial, and of course non-commercial is not the right word, but I mean, I suppose they're commercially critical. I suppose I'm going to use that word. That's my word. The record company took it very much, the opposite view. They were brilliant at promoting this album. But I can remember then very, very clearly two massive gigs that they did that summer in 97. Bryan Adams was the summer of 69. I did the summer of 97. And they did the biggest gig for them to date had been their gig in the RDS, where they did to 38,000 people. And I remember I had a job at a time picking strawberries, where you had to go out. I've talked about it before in the pod, where you had to literally crawl like a snake along the ground, trying to break off strawberries from their little green stems. And I remember someone I hadn't been at the gig, but I remember someone it was at the gig, and I can remember it now, just the enthusiasm about this show and about what the gig was. And I went back and looked at the set list for that gig in the RDS stand. It's a terrific set list drawn from the 3 albums that they had to date. But they also did that later on. They also did the Glastonbury in '97, shortly after OK Computer had been released, and it's a terrific show. I mean, it's just incredible, and you get it on YouTube. But this is an album of its time, but with a very firm eye on the future and a critical, angsty eye. And it's remarkably profound, I think, that this album was released before the traditional model of music broke down. Okay, so the traditional model being you had a band and they did singles, they did albums, they did tours, and you had to get a big record company to break in and so on. That was all about to change. And by the year 2000, that had changed. And by the early 2000s, it was beginning to be history. Now it looks like something from a different world. But I think it's very profound that Radiohead's OK Computer was one of the last big albums before everything changed. And in the title itself and throughout the tracks, you get that eye to the future, the eye to what technology was going to do. And they're soothsayers that almost of the future, weren't they, really?
Big time. And like, one of the things about Radiohead, right, that when you, even if you think of Father Ted, and you have that scene with Tommy Tiernan sitting on the bus and he's listening to Radiohead, and he suddenly gets depressed from listening to Radiohead. Like, I think it's exit music from a film, actually, that he's listening to on the bus, which is on this album. But like, people often say, Radiohead, they're a very depressing band. Now, a lot of bands get labeled with that. Like, I don't know about you, Paul, but that's not the experience I have of Radiohead.
Not at all.
I like, look at this album. Like, I know we're going to get on to the various tracks now in a minute, but like, this is not, like, Radiohead have never been in any sense a one-trick pony, and their music depicts all facets of human emotion to me. Like, some of the songs they've released are frankly bangers. Like, you could hear them in a club and dance to them. Others are songs you could play around a campfire. Others are songs that are incredibly uplifting. Like, it's completely unfair on Radiohead to label them as this kind of depressing band, I think. What do you think? How do they make you feel?
I completely agree with you, Dan. And I mean, this album is an album that has never really left my side, as it were, in the years since 1997. But on returning to do a deeper listen, I found great hope in it. And if you listen to that track, the opening track, Airbag, which is a terrific way to open a record. Yes, open with that song that sets the pace, that defines the sound, that brings you into the album's world. And this chorus, and it's just sung so terrifically by Tom York, where he says, "I am born again." It is just like, it's extraordinary. And only the great thing about this record is that only Radiohead could make these songs. There's no other band that could do this. Many tried to copy them. No one ever equaled them. This is unique. They are unique in what they do. And I certainly don't find them bleak. But I do think what they do is, and what gives me great hope, is that they don't cast necessarily a positive eye and say, feel good about this. What they do is they call you to question things. And they change how you look at things. And I think that's what makes them great artists. I mean, that's a tribute to, a great novel or a great work of art, or, a great album can do that. It can change how you think about something. And I think, OK Computer can do that. And I think that's very hopeful, actually.
Big time. And I'm so glad you mentioned Airbag, because it's definitely one of my top 3, because, like, it, as you say, what a way to start an album. Like, and you can hear Radiohead stepping into new territory here as a band. Like, to have a drum loop on that first song, like, they're trying to sound, the year before, you had this incredible album released by DJ Shadow called Introducing. If people haven't heard it, go and listen to it. It's incredible. But the guys loved the Love the album. And they're trying to kind of emulate that sound in the drum loop on this track. In fact, Tom York worked with DJ Shadow the following year. Another great song. It's called Rabbit in Your Headlights, and the video for it is brilliant. Check it out on YouTube if you haven't heard it. Rabbit in Your Headlights. But I love that sound on this song. I love like Colin Greenwood is an incredible bass player. Like his bass lines are so clever. Like if you listen to the minimalist bass line on this track, it almost sounds like robotic, glitchy, without any effects. It's just like a straightforward bass sound. But whatever way he's kind of playing it, it brings me into that kind of technological space in a subtle way. It's very hard to explain how it works, but when you're listening to the song, again, listeners, just be mindful of the bass line, and I think you'll understand what I mean. And like, to the point you mentioned in terms of this being kind of energetic and so on, like it is about Tom York's experience of a car crash he had in 1987, and he emerged from the car crash relatively unscathed, at least physically. And he's writing here about, how an airbag saved his life. So this is the irony immediately of the album. So it's an album that casts a critical eye on technology, but at the same time, the main protagonist of the album starts his story saying that technology saved his life. Like that's brilliant. It's absolute poetry.
Absolutely, Dan. I mean, and what they do is they marry that kind of critique with technology by a full-on embrace of what technology could do to their sound. I mean, and that's, their ability to embrace that contradiction, as it were, sort of reveals them as the kind of artists really that they are. And I think, this is an incredibly clever, profound album. And I mean, you mentioned the bass. The bass is terrific. It's what you might call banging. I'm not aware if that word is around in 1997, but it's banging. The bass on its own is worth listening to and worth trying to isolate. Fascinating how they recorded the album, Dan, in that an awful lot of it was recorded live. And they had these comments that they were trying to make an electronic album with musical instruments. And the strings were added separately at the end in Abbey Road Studios. But an awful lot of it was recorded live. And you can kind of hear that, and you referred to it earlier, you can hear that, there is a kind of a live sound to Radiohead. And there's no doubt about it. I mean, I mentioned the 2 gigs there in 97, one in Glastonbury, one in the RDS in Dublin. And there's no doubt about it that as a live band, this is, Radiohead are terrific. Now, interestingly, while they are an incredible live band, their live sort of experience hasn't been unproblematic for the band. And, again, you could say a huge amount about that, but one of the reasons that OK Computer came into being was that they had toured with Alanis Morissette in 96 in North America. And it hadn't been an entirely happy experience from the band. And the tone for this record was set during that tour. Dan, we've talked about Airbag, which is amazing and which opens the album really, really well. We've mentioned Fitter, Happier, which, gets their 2 honorable mentions. If I had a top 5, I'd put them in top 5, but we normally do top 3. Now, I'm not going to put Lucky in my top 3, but my other 3 top tracks are all singles. So I come in with Karma Police at number 3. I think, again, I remember where I was when I first heard it, when I first saw the video. It was actually, would you believe it or not, Dan, it was on the Den. You remember the Den used to occasionally play music on RTE2? And I remember that. And on it, there you have Zigzag and whatever other puppets are there, Ray Darcy, and then they play a song. They never used to play the full thing, which would frustrate me. But anyway, they played Karma Police, and it just bowled me over at the time, because I think back in those days, music wasn't quite as accessible as it is now. You had to save up to get the album. So I don't think I had the album yet, because you'd have a little list of albums and you'd be checking them off as you would get them. But it just blew me away, Karma Police. And that line, if for a minute there I lost myself. I know I've known people down through the years who've just really related to that, and have loved hearing that live and loved the experience of that. My number 2 would be no surprises. Now, so much to say about this, but I'll just do two takes. It sounds to me, Dan, like a piece of music coming out of a machine. For example, if you had, it brings to mind for me a kind of a little music box that a child might have. There's a kind of a lullaby quality to it, but the lyrics and the vocals are just tremendous. And I love that line where he says, bring down, I won't sing it, you'll be glad to hear, I won't hum it either, but he says, bring down the government, they don't speak for me. And of course, if you remember the time, Dan, the new Labour government in Britain was just 2 weeks old when OK Computer was released. And this, that line was seen as a kind of a rebuke, if you will, of that. But they could, of course, be referring to the previous John Major Conservative government. We shall never know, because obviously it would have been written and recorded when the Tories were still in power. But anyway, I mean, it would be wrong not to mention some of the politics, because, of course, one of the books that had inspired Tom York's lyrically was Manufacturing Consent by Chomsky. And, you know, you can hear the politics coming out throughout the album, but it's there and no surprise. Number one for me goes to Paranoid Android, the lead single. I mean, I remember hearing On Top of the Pops. That's where I heard that one for the first time. I mean, it is an incredible piece of music. It would bring to mind, of course, Bohemian Rhapsody. I mean, I think that's the track that most, you know, that you know, it's a track that it reminds me of that. But one of the things about it is, I remember seeing an interview with Tom York. I think at the time it was put to him, there's no chorus here, and he said they're all every bit is a chorus. And you know, it is incredibly tuneful, and you never forget. It's just gets into your head. And that line that Tom York has, where he goes, "What's this?" For me, when I first heard that, for whatever reason, I imagined the end of the world and one surviving person looking at all this ruination and saying, "What's this?" That's just the image that came to me at the time. But I just think, you know, that's my top three, Dan. But I mean, and you know, and two honorable mentions for Airbag and Fitter Happier. There's other tracks you could put on that, but you know, we have to make a choice. How about you?
Yeah,
I top three.
I love the way you talked about the kind of imagery that Paranoid Android evoked for you, because if you and the end of the world and that kind of thing, because interestingly how the video for it was made, and people might be familiar with the video, it's kind of like an animation, and it's quite a disturbing video. Like when they were making the video, the guys in the band said they wanted a video that would be funny and yet sick at the same time. And it was made by a guy called Magnus Carlsson, who's a Swedish cartoonist. And how he came up with the idea for the video was he listened to a lyricless version of the song in his office for 12 hours straight. And as he listened to the music, he jotted down ideas for imagery. And the imagery in the music video is definitely quite striking. And it's basically this character called Robin, surrounded by kind of images of seediness and violence. So it definitely, as a song, evokes all kinds of imagery for different kinds of people. And that's the thing about Radiohead. Their music is often so deep that people can read different things into the lyrics. But yeah, I definitely hear what you're saying about it. It reminds me of Bohemian Rhapsody. To me, it reminds me a little bit of the Beatles tune, Happiness is a Warm Gun. Funny enough, I don't know whether it's because the Beatles are kind of in my mind at the moment, because I recently watched a new documentary, but there's loads of kind of Beatles hints in this album for me. So there's that song, which reminds me of Happiness is a Warm Gun. The other song you mentioned, No Surprises, reminds me of a Beatles song from the White Album also called Sexy Sadie. And then Fitter Happier reminds me of Revolution number 9 from the White Album. So I don't know why, maybe it's just me, but I hear those kind of things in the music. I love the guitar solos from Paranoid Android. I think it's like Johnny Greenwood at his best. Like, he's just the sheer kind of sound in it. It is incredible. And I mean, Ed O'Brien as well is another amazing guitarist. Some of the sounds he manages to get out of his guitar on this album, they don't sound like a guitar at all. He's brilliant. I just love the band for their kind of skills on their instruments. but yeah, one of my, so I said Paranoid Android as one of them. Airbag's another one. One of them, I didn't pick No Surprises, though I do want to comment on the No Surprises song briefly. The video for that is startling. So it's Tom York kind of being submerged, just his face being submerged by water. And it's as if he's going to drown, but he doesn't seem to care. He seems numbed to the fact he's going to drown. And I think that goes very well with a song that's sweet but melancholy, and kind of gives the message in a way that, you know, everything is a bit shit, but you want no surprises at all costs. So the video is an act of genius to me. But
yeah, I agree.
And my third one is a controversial one. I've heard other reviewers and critics listing this song as their least favorite on the album. I love Electioneering, for a particular reason. One is that it rocks. I think in some ways you can hear how bands like Muse were very influenced by Radiohead. You know, this is like the Helter Skelter of the OK Computer album. It really is a kind of a banging, pumping rock song, and with great guitar parts, loads of energy. But I remember listening to this song during the big financial crisis. And it just really resonated with me during that time, which was obviously about 10 years. It was just over 10 years after this album was released. But the lyrics in the song, riot shields, voodoo economics, cattle prods, and the IMF, just really resonated with me during the financial crisis. And I think, again, it's a song that sounds so fresh and absolutely timeless.
Yeah, it's a terrific track, and I think also maybe it's reflection on their unease about the position they found themselves in promoting their music, because it was that was always a challenge, I think, for Radiohead, to put it mildly. But I mean, for me, Dan, how I would sum it all up is, and again, I'm going to just borrow from Damon Albarn. I heard him recently talk about how his new record was an attempt by him and a group of orchestral musicians to play the landscape in Iceland, where he has a house, the view, and so on. And for me, this album plays the landscape of 1997 with an eye to the future, and it's powerful, it's interesting. It's got so much on it that you just keep returning to it again and again and again. And I think your point earlier on about them being ahead of the curve means it'll never ever date. And for me, I'm going to just go. There's so much more that it almost feels wrong to make a top three. I mean, we haven't. You could easily put Lucky. We haven't even put. Lucky was a single as well. We haven't even put that in either of our lists, which seems like something of a crime. It's just a terrific song, and exit music for from a film, and the story behind that track as well, in terms of the Romeo and Juliet. And it didn't eventually it wasn't in the soundtrack, but it was commissioned for the soundtrack, and just the sound of that and the youth that's in that and the sort of vibrancy, and it's just an extraordinary track. But for me, Dan, this album gets 10 out of 10. I'm not going to put any flaws. I'm not going to point to any flaws. I'm not going to see any difficulties at all. I just think it's an incredible album. How could you not give it any less than 10 out of 10? How could you, Doc Marks?
Yeah, NME gave it 10 out of 10 when it was first released. And this is going to be the first album on the big album show that both of us have given 10 out of 10 to. I'm going to give it 10 out of 10 as well. And the funny thing about this is that most bands in their career, right, they might have like one 10 out of 10 album. But when you think about Radiohead, as I mentioned some of them earlier on, and like Kid A, In Rainbows, some people are really into their early stuff. Like I'm into Radiohead. I love all Radiohead albums, but I particularly like In Rainbows, Kid A, and OK Computer, and I just think Radiohead, they can't do wrong in my eyes. Like the thing I love most about them is that they have always evolved throughout their career. Like each album sounds different. Each album experiments, and each album excites and touches on parts of the psyche that other bands don't reach. And I think for all of those reasons, this album in particular is completely timeless, and people will be returning to this album for many, 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 many decades to come.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more with you. Before we let our listeners go from this pod, just to remind people, please like us and subscribe us. Like us on your social media at The Big Album Show. Subscribe on where you can. Just support us, please, where you can. We'd really appreciate people who do listen to the podcasts, just to spread the word for us. And thank you for listening. It means so very much. The next pod we have is about Achtung Baby, U2's masterpiece from 1991, recently past its third decade, its 30th birthday. And we'll have a very special guest, Dan, for that show. Until then, thanks for listening and goodbye.
Slán. You're listening to The Big Album Show with Paul Dillon and Dan O'Neill.